Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's going to be an interesting afternoon, I hope. I hope everybody learns something. I certainly learned a lot in putting this lecture recital together. I'll be doing all of my talking first and all of my playing second, because I have to go on a 3-day camel track to get there. A little few things that I want to play as I'm talking about them. I will use the electronic keyboard here. I don't go bail for the quality of the sound. But before we start any discussion about keyboard technique of any kind during the Baroque, which is that period which nominally started on January 1st, 1600, and nominally ended with the death of Bach in 1750. But it's worth reminding a modern listener that unlike today's specialist performers on piano, harpsichord, and organ, keyboard players of both the Renaissance and the Baroque were expected to move amongst the organ, the harpsichord, and the clavichord as a matter of course. While each instrument had its own special sound production systems which required different responses from the player, such techniques were all part and parcel of the performer's repertoire of skills and techniques. For example, the Bebung effect, which is achievable on the clavichord, is useless at the organ, and dynamic effects are differently produced on each instrument. Equally important at that time was the art of improvisation, and unfortunately it remains alive today within the classical sphere almost exclusively amongst those of us who play the organ. But we can say that the same type of improvisatory nature which that implies has had a resurgence in the 20th century in jazz. In this lecture, I intend to focus on keyboard styles of the Low Countries, England and present-day northern Germany, from the late 16th until the mid-18th centuries. I should also say that at this period of the time frame, the various provinces which make up the present-day Netherlands and present-day Belgium, and the various principalities, duchies, and electorates, and so forth, which much later coalesced into modern Germany, were all independent political units. So when we talk about Dutch or German, we're actually using modern terms anachronistically. The concept of variation by the use of divisions was useful to keyboardists even through the Renaissance. Examples date back to the late Middle Ages, and you have in your handout an example of one of the leaves of the Robertsbridge Codex of 1380, which shows this style of tabulature. And it's the same tablature which later appears in German sources, although scholars are divided as to whether it went from England to Germany or Germany to England and back. Conrad Paumann, who lived from 1410 to 73, wrote a book called The Fundamentum Organisandi, which became part of the Lochamer Liederbuch of the 1450s. And this is one of the first surviving examples of a tutorial manual for organists. It includes entabulations of vocal works, as well as works on a set cantus firmus, where the upper voice or voices, because they never run to more than 3 parts, deviate so markedly from any other surviving source and are so highly complicated that they can be thought to be newly composed. Paumann himself was highly famous as a performer and is one of the first famous keyboardists known to us by name. John Butt uses this to suggest that this very renown of Paumann marks a shift in the importance of keyboard music to a level similar to that of vocal music. Since Paumann was blind and presumably improvised most of what he played, it's rather more surprising that his works survive, because of course he wouldn't have written them down. The fact that they do is perhaps a tribute to the exemplary qualities that they possess for students. Some of Paumann's works were included also in the Buchsheimer Orgelbuch, the second portion of which is thought to come from the 1470s and incorporates material from Paumann's larger circle of students and friends. The 256 examples that are in that book employ sections of liturgical chant as well as secular songs, so there is obviously use both within the church and without. There are numerous examples of such texts throughout the 16th century, each of which shows the gradual development of keyboard polyphony, and you have a list in your handout of some of those people. They include Paul Hofheimer, Arnold Schlick, and Hans Büchner, followed a bit later by Elias Amerbach and Bernhard Schmidt. Division variations were popular with harpsichordists and clavichordists and lutenists, although they weren't a keyboard instrument, partly because they provide the ability to sustain long note values by filling in the otherwise dead space with running note patterns based around a principal note. While we as organists don't have a sustainability problem, unless, of course, our friend who pumps the bellows has decided that we've done enough for today, or we didn't pay the electricity bill, but the sound once produced is a static sound. So similar movement of pitches is helpful in terms of providing direction and pace to a longer melodic line. The other, and in the final analysis, perhaps primary reason for divisions was for the performer to show his grasp of the techniques of ornamentation and his own virtuosity as a performer. This urge to be creative, by the way, was not limited to keyboard and lute players. One of the earliest non-keyboard instructional manuals for using division was that of Silvestro Ganassi. This was published in 1535 and was entitled The Opera Intitolata Fontgara, and it was written for the instruction of recorder players. And you have some examples in your handout. Also the same with Jan van Eyck, who a century later published Der Lustige Flutenhof in Amsterdam. That was also for the recorder. The former, that is Ganassi, is much more a theoretical work than Van Eyck. And Van Eyck tends to be written out versions of dance music and songs rather than a codified method book. Now you can see, if you turn in your handout to pages 8 and 9, and the actual tune is at the top of the left-hand page, how divisions begin to work. Unfortunately, the edition you've got there is a 1950s edition, but it's one of the first attempts at bringing early music into the modern forum. It's not a particularly scholarly edition, but it gives you the idea. You see the tune at the top, and then one variation, and then another. It's perhaps useful while we're talking about this, because you can see at the bottom of the right-hand page that the final note has an ornament on it with a modern sign. It's perhaps useful now to talk about the difference between ornaments and divisions. Ornaments, in the context I'm speaking of, are short embellishments or graces, as the short trill or a mordent or something similar. These are useful in shaping a melodic line and have relatively fixed forms. Divisions, on the other hand, are extended strings of scale-like passagework which connect the long notated pitches. And Ganassi says, and I quote, "Every division must begin and end with the same note as the unornamented ground." Close quote. Now that sounds like it would be a really, really strict rule. But even within that, there's lots of room for diversity. You can vary the time, that is, the proportion you give each of the principal notes. You can vary the rhythm, you can vary the direction of the melody, and you can do those either singly or in combination. Of course, in ensemble playing, large flights of fancy were most probably linked to the top voice and seldom used by the lowest. But even then, And when we consider that ensemble players were not the big symphony-type groups of today, even then I think top-line players weren't free to wander too far away. But for solo, that is unaccompanied playing, it seems like there weren't any limits other than your own technical facility and musicality. If you look at Ganassi's tables of exemplars on pages 6 and 7, which form the bulk of Ganassi's book, you come to several realizations quite quickly. First, the breadth of variety is impressively large, despite any limitations of the range of the recorder at both top and bottom. And I've printed you 2 pages of his How to Vary the One Cadence at the top of the first page. There are about 6 pages of just those exemplars. And if you look at it again, you'll see that much of what he does is actually generated almost by mathematics. In essence, Ganassi gives his students models, and from those they are to develop their own individual preferences and specialities. As I said before, Ganassi writes for recorder players, but the principle is sound across the board. Several works appear much later, or rather similar work appears later in Christopher Simpson's The Division Viol, dealing with the ornamentation of a ground in the bass, which is a different thing than ornamenting the melody. Even later still, in 1706, John Walsh of London publishes an anonymous book called The Division Flute. Now that is well within Bach's lifetime, but we don't associate Bach with divisions as we would normally think of them, as much as with a highly florid melodic style. And yet, even Tosi, at least in the second edition of his work in English, which was published in 1743, has a chapter on divisions. Now, whether that is an English usage, my Italian isn't good enough to say, but the fact is that even at that time, and that's 7 years before Bach's death, the English are still talking about divisions as a way to describe passage work. Essentially, divisions came from a highly mathematized system of how to get from A to B by filling in all the way. Students learned various formulae to apply in certain situations, but they did so with their own individuality. Therefore, this was usually improvisatory material, and it wasn't written down, and most of it was not preserved. It probably began with something as simple as filling in intervals with passing tones, or adding upper and lower neighboring tones to create movement. In various situations, these will have developed into fixed ornaments, such as the mordent or the tierce de coulée. But from there, it expanded to much more creative use of what theoreticians today would call harmonic and non-harmonic tones. But through the latter half of the 16th century, more was being written down than had been written down previously. And this material found its way back and forth across the English Channel, particularly between England and what we now call the Netherlands. We tend to think of Netherlands composers of the 16th century in terms of vocal works and less so for instrumental. But Netherlanders, like New Zealanders, were inveterate travelers, and they often worked in the Italian peninsula for the various city-states or for the church, as well as in now modern Spain and Germany. Therefore, it is not improbable that the work of the Venetian, Ganassi, was known in Antwerp, Amsterdam, or Utrecht, leaving aside Paris and London. This view of Netherlanders away from home obscures what was happening in the various centers of this very small area of Northwest Europe. In Antwerp, for example, the primary focus of the city was commerce and trade. Now, this meant a large cosmopolitan community of businessmen, English, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, you name it, and they were all there. Now, one of the results of this, because we are dealing here with, if not the aristocratic class, certainly the upper bourgeoisie, This was a demand for music as a commercial commodity, almost in a way that we would see it today. So Antwerp itself developed as a center for the production of printed music and instruments on which to play it. But all this activity wasn't just for export. The rising bourgeoisie in the local community, in their various societies and confraternities, demanded ever more new material for their annual feast day observances and other public and private occasions. And by 1550, Antwerp was only one of among many centers who was in this position. This is the environment into which Jan Pedersen Sweelinck was born in Amsterdam in 1562. Northern Europe was in the throes of a variety of religious reforms, some of which were more inimical to music than others. The version of these reforms which resulted in the Great Alteration of 1578, when Amsterdam became a Protestant city, meant that the old churches and other ecclesiastical properties were taken over by the local authority. The daily recitals, for which Sweelinck became justly famous, were civic programs for which secular music was desirable. This is one reason why Sweelinck's extant oeuvre has relatively few chorale preludes and consists largely of sets of variations on well-known songs, or fantasies and toccatas, echo fantasies, all of which are designed to impress. At this period, the organ was not a welcome guest in the Calvinist service style. That there are any sacred songs set for keyboard by Sweelinck is probably due to the large preponderance of home entertainment, where singing and playing pluck-stringed instruments such as lute or harpsichord was popular. Bearing in mind, this is before TV or the internet or the radio or anything. Many of Sweelinck's works are practicable on such instruments and could well have been used in this context, particularly as they are notated in tablature, as opposed to what we would now recognize as music notation. Music was transferable between home instruments and the organ because there was no obligato pedal line. In other words, you didn't have to play a pedal line. Dutch organs of this particular period had limited pedal departments anyway, so much of the music was written for manuals alone. In addition to the teaching Sweelinck's father, who was also an organist, had given him, Sweelinck was exposed to other influences too. During this whole period, and remember the dates, between 1562 and 1600, there was a lot of movement between England and the Netherlands on two fronts. Recusant Catholic families in England who were trying to stay Catholic came to be able to practice their faith. Those people of the Puritan persuasion who felt that things at home were just moving way too slowly also came so that they could do their thing in terms of how they wished to worship, because the Anglican Church wasn't doing it for them. Both sides, that is, both the Catholic and Puritan sides, were also looking for places to publish their own works, because, of course, the Crown had a monopoly on publication, and if Elizabeth's ministers didn't want it published, it wasn't. So if you could publish on the continent, you could then smuggle stuff across again. So we have composers such as Peter Phillips, who lived from approximately 1560 to 1628. He found refuge in Brussels so that he could continue to practice Catholic faith. And he ended up being friends with Peter Cornet, who was the principal organist there. John Bull, whose dates are almost identical, 1562 to 1628, was also a permanent expat, but his reasons for being overseas weren't nearly so noble. He'd come up through the Anglican process, but he managed to get himself accused of adultery, and he fled to Antwerp and eventually became the cathedral organist there. But both Phillips and Bull were exponents of the virginals, and their style would have been known to Sweelinck as his was to them, and there are some indications that perhaps they all knew each other as friends. So of course they would have been aware of how they were writing. And works by all three appear in the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, which is one of the major sources of music from this period. So this brings us to the first piece I'm going to play for you today. It's a set of variations on one of those new hot tunes that everybody knew. It was #1 in the top 40 of early 17th century Europe. Es Mas was written by Pierre Guitteron in Paris as part of a masque for the sister of the King of Paris, or King of France rather, and it appeared in a collection of songs as early as 1613. Now this tune was so popular, it was used all over the place throughout the 17th century. Van Eyck's book has a version of it as a courante, popular dance, and Giles Farnaby's version, called the New Say Who, appears in the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book. Even later, this tune has traveled the world with a whole set of contrafacta or alternative texts, and was being sung in Germany prior to World War I as a sea shanty. And it was there shown to be a Dutch work, but we know it wasn't, that it was actually French. According to Gustav Leonhardt, whose edition I'm using to play from today, the tune was still being sung in the Netherlands in the 1980s to a text, and my Dutch is not good, Ga je mee over het zee. This is a binary tune of limited range and rhythmic variety, perfectly suited for the kinds of division style that we've talked about. This tune works canonically also, so Sweelinck inserts moments of canon between the melody, which is always in the top voice, and one of the inner parts where he desires it. For example, if you look on page 10, in variation 1, between the soprano and the tenor voices. And I'll just play a little bit of that so you can hear it. Starting right at the beginning. And then it wanders off to do something different. So we can't say that it's a true canon in full, as we'll get to a bit later, but there are things in there. Throughout this set of variations, and you've got a bit of variation 3 on your page as well, you'll notice that each one is slightly more complex in terms of rhythms and note values and all that kind of thing. Sometimes just one thing's changed, sometimes more than one. In the second to last variation, the penultimate one goes into compound meter, and then it comes back to simple meter to close. We might consider this music as a bit sort of chunky and angular and stiff, but to me there's a quality about it, a sort of freshness and naivete and presence that sort of demands to be accepted, and don't mess with it, it's fine, just the way it is. In addition to being a composer and a performer, Sweelinck was also justly famous as a teacher. Organ students came to Amsterdam from all over Northern Europe, from what we would call modern Denmark to Northern Germany. It can reasonably be said that Sweelinck was teacher to almost an entire generation of German organists, who in turn passed his performance and compositional techniques on to their own students, and so on down the line. It's rather like Queen Victoria became the grandmother of Europe at a later date. Samuel Scheidt was one of these students of Sweelinck during the period 1605 to 1608, along with Samuel's brother Gottfried. Aside from this period, he spent his whole life in Halle, despite the turmoil of the 30 Years' War. His primary employer during this period was the Margrave of Brandenburg. In 1624, his Tabulatura Nova was released in 3 parts. Aside from the contents themselves, this work is important because it uses staff notation rather than tablature for its presentation. And that means that for the first time, we can actually look at it and read it the way we would read music today. Whether performers played from staff notation isn't clear. Some scholars think that the player wasn't going to buy the whole book, perhaps, but was copying out what he wanted to do, might have made his copy in tablature because that's what he was used to playing from. Certainly, composers later than Scheidt were still using keyboard tablature to write their works, and we have excellent examples by Bruns and Buxtehude and others to show that. But it's with Scheidt that the published presentation of works in score notation and the title, therefore, New Tablature, becomes significant. The Tabulatura Nova contains a wide variety of material: German chorales, Latin hymns, fantasias, secular songs, and so on. And the first 2 parts of this are thrown together in no really discernible particular order. It's a kind of grab bag, reach in and grab what you want. But part 3 is different. Part 3 contains music for the Lutheran service, including hymns, magnificats, and portions of the Mass still employed within the Lutheran liturgy, that is, the Kyrie, the Gloria, and the Credo. It probably also could have been used in Catholic churches where there were organists who wished to play. I'll be playing for you today a set of variations on the Christmas song, Gelobet seist du Jesu Christ. This hymn, or we might call it a carol incorrectly if we're talking about Christmas, it's still part of the scene in Germany today, so it's been around for the best part of 400 years. And you can see on page 12 the beginnings of that work. The parallels between this piece and the Sweeling variations will become obvious, I think, to any but the most unintelligent listener. Scheidt was a faithful student of his teacher, but he was not a slavish imitator. While Sweeling tended to keep the melody in the top line, Scheidt allows the melody to go anywhere it wants to. It in fact appears in all 4 of the standard 4-part textures. One variation out of the 7, however many there are, is a classic bichinium. In other words, it's 2 voices in a similar range, and this is one of Scheidt's trademarks, is to have a bichinium with what's called invertible counterpoint at the 12th. If you don't know what that means, ask me after. In this one, there are variations where the melody is played in the pedal as well. The German pedal division was much more developed than the Dutch one. Sweeling sticks to the manuals only. In the final 2 variations, where the basso colorato and soprano colorato are particularly notable for strict style division work, particularly in the outlines of octaves and other non-consecutive intervals. There's an example of the beginning of this on page 12 at the bottom of your handout. And the text for this chorale, and I'm sorry I don't have an English translation, but the text is on page 13. I'll just play you a little bit of this. You see, you have this. And that's where the tune is. What's going on in the right hand is kind of, well, just keeping a tonal harmonic structure. Despite the quality of Scheidt as both composer and purveyor of a new notational system, it was not from Halle, although it was Handel's birthplace later, that the great dissemination of chorale variation technique was to come. But it came from others of Sweeling's students who settled in Hamburg and Lübeck, from Heinrich Scheidemann and Jakob Pretorius, through Matthias Weckmann and Johann Adam Reinken to Franz Tunder, Dietrich Buxtehude, and in its final flowering, Johann Sebastian Bach. The general outlines of Bach's life and works are well known and need no repetition here. Nor does his influence on musicians since his death need any particular stress. But for those outside the sphere of the organ, his works for that instrument are not nearly as familiar as his compositions for other solo instruments and ensembles, though I think here we can perhaps accept from that statement the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. I think everybody knows that one. As a practicing church musician, Bach was intimately acquainted with the texts and tunes of the great majority of the Lutheran chorales. One only has to look at his numerous chorale settings, both large and small, instrumental and vocal within the cantatas, to find an extensive variety of treatments of the cantus firmus. As a book of teaching pieces, the Orgelbüchlein, the little organ book, is unsurpassed. And in fact, the 20th century French composer Dupré wrote a book of 79 chorales, which was modeled on what Bach had already done. Quite often within these, the accompanying lines are constructed from melodic fragments, or there are other motifs which indicate mood and text painting. One can sort of understand the allure during the late 19th century of attributing to Bach emotions and concepts that were perhaps not really his. But there is reason to be wary of too much hindsight being applied. I don't believe that Bach was a numerologist or wrote his works so that the note names added up to sacred integers or his own name, or that he worried about any of that stuff. I believe he was too much of an improviser and genuine musician for such things to be his guiding lights. For example, there's a well-known apocryphal anecdote which describes how Johann Adam Reinken, as a very elderly man, met Bach, a young man, and how Bach, after improvising a lengthy fantasia on the chorale On Wasserfließ in Babylon, which paid homage to Reinken's fantasia on the same tune. And when he came down from the organ, Reinken said, "I thought this art was dead, but I can see that it lives in you." And even if that story is only apocryphal, it says something about Bach's grab of how people reacted to what he did. And even in Bach's last years, while he was exploring the outer edges of formal counterpoint in such works as the Art of Fugue, Bach is never confined by the rules. Moments of genius occur when he breaks the rules, knowing that he is doing so. And of course, there is the even more apocryphal story, and I can't source it, but I remember hearing it as a student, that someone at the Paris Conservatoire marked some of Bach's fugues as exercises in counterpoint, and that Bach's average grade was C-. So obviously he broke rules. The last piece for performance today is not one of the rule breakers, but shows a transcendent grasp of contrapuntal technique. Written in 1747, the canonic variations on the Christmas song Vom Himmel hoch employ every musical device at Bach's command. You have the text of 15 verses on pages 14 and 15, but Bach only took 5 of them for this particular set of variations. And in these, the tune, which is always obvious, even when it's highly ornamented, but Bach uses material from the tune itself to create a strict, and I do mean strict, canon between 2 of the 3 or 4 voices. And you can see on page 16, I've given you extracts of the original published edition. And you'll notice there the comment that that's how it was published. The canon was not completely written out. In variation 1, the canon is at the octave between the 2 hands, and the melody just sits in long values in the pedal. In essence, the second is the same, except that the canonic interval is a 5th rather than the octave, and these are obvious. In the third variation, The canon is between the left hand and pedal. At the 7th, with the tune appearing in the upper voice of the right hand. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the 7th is such an awkward interval. How could anybody, unless today we are all really stupid, how could anybody carry that in their head and have it move in parallel sevenths at half a bar apart and keep it going while still doing all this other stuff? To me, it just boggles my mind. But the canon sounds like this. And it sort of keeps on going. Now, in variation 4, we go back to having the tune plain and simple in the pedal, but the canon is between the right hand, which is the top staff of that group, against the tenor line in the left hand, but the tenor line goes twice as slowly, so the line is an augmentation. Again, can you imagine carrying that in your head while you were playing everything else? I can't, and I'm sure that despite Schmidt having published them with just the beginnings, the incipits, I would suspect most people wrote them out before they tried to play them. In the last variation, we get the full treatment. We get canons at all sorts of intervals, canons in inversion where the tune is going the right way up in one part of it and upside down in the other, and in and out and over and under. And then at the end, in the last 3 bars, which you have there, you get all 4 lines of the tune at once, or more or less at once, and I've gone over them with colored pencil so that you can see where each line is. There are, within each variation, elements of the old-fashioned division style where thirds are filled in, or you get running passages in order to, where you could have used a crotchet otherwise. But it doesn't matter. By 1747, counterpoint, strict counterpoint, was also not the fashion. We have some of the sons of Bach complaining about how, Dad, can't you write something up to date? But for the learned society for which these were written as entrance examination, and the German for that is the Korrespondierenden Sozietät der Musikalischen Wissenschaften in Leipzig. Germans are wonderful, the way they compile words. But for this group, who were judging this, these variations were yet another indicator that this composer has complete mastery of whatever material he chooses to use. It is this total control which makes Bach not only a great composer, that is, when he wrote things down, but also guaranteed his fame as an improviser. And it is the application of these skills that writers such as Genasi and Palman and Schmidt and all the rest sought to develop as a form. I think we can say that within the realm of the organ, that they succeeded quite well. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take I can take questions now or after I play, whichever the panel feels appropriate. Just play, okay. So the first thing will be Sveling, S-Mars. The second one will be Gelobet seist du Jesu Christ, which is a Christmas chorale, and then a Bye Bye Scheit, and then at the end, Bach, the canonic variations on Vom Himmel hoch, which is also a Christmas song. And I suppose in that sense we consider them seasonally appropriate, sort of.